All right, we're going to be taking a closer look at the benchmarks, of the Mac Mini with the M1 chip. And so to do that, I just wanted to show you a couple of devices we're going to be comparing it to. So first, we actually have some older iOS devices. So we have an iPhone 10 on the left, and it's actually a second generation iPad Pro on the right. So that means on the right, the iPad is using the A10X chip, whereas the iPhone is using the A11. And so it's just kind of interesting comparisons, generation over generation improvements. And then, the M1, which would be kind of the A14, all the changes then. Moving along, this is a 2018 MacBook Pro, 15-inch. So it has an Intel Core i7, and it has an AMD Radeon Pro 555X. And of course, then we just finished building, this is a custom build that I did that has an AMD 5600X, so that's AMD's new Zen 3 architecture, and it has an AMD 5700 graphics card. And below that, we actually also have some testing on a first generation Ryzen system. So this has the AMD 1700X. So you can also see some comparisons there. And finally, in the background is my iMac. That is a 2017 iMac, which has an Intel Core i5 and an AMD Pro 570. So if you couldn't tell, these are just all the devices that I own sort of over the course of the last couple of years. But it makes for interesting comparisons because you can see how things improve and, is the M1 chip really a big jump or just the natural evolution of things? I will say that using the Apple M1 is noticeably, it feels faster. So as opposed to when I use my 2017 iMac or 2018 MacBook Pro, they're more or less the same. The laptop's actually faster, it has a better processor, but the graphics is much quicker in the iMac. And so the overall sort of snappiness feels similar. But going to the M1, it definitely felt quicker and snappier and everything opens faster. Although likewise, I will say, going from, on the PC side, from the Ryzen 1 1700 to now the 5600X also feels noticeably faster. Everything from boot up to launching apps. It definitely feels like a quicker system. One device that's not here is a 12-inch MacBook, just the MacBook from 2015. If you remember, that was Apple's first laptop without a fan using the Intel Core M processors. But I was able to do some benchmarks with that, so we'll be throwing that in the loop because that is a really interesting comparison, particularly if you're looking at the new MacBook Air with the M1 chip, to show just how far Apple has come with low power processors and compared to where Intel was. And a quick note, after running the benchmarks and everything, I did in fact edit this entire video using the Mac Mini, and it's pretty great. Everything worked really quickly, and just sort of anecdotally did feel snappier than using the other Macs, my older iMac or MacBook Pro. So that's pretty cool.
Okay, this is what we're here for, the Geekbench scores, right? Well, don't worry, I have other benchmarks and comparisons as well, but Geekbench is the most universal tool right now, so it's the easiest one to start with a lot of devices. And we'll dive into groupings of these as we go. But I wanted to give you a high-level overview of all the devices and all the scores so you can take a look as you wish. A few things to note here. From the top, so I'm sure you're already familiar with the high M1 Geekbench scores. You will notice if you go to Rosetta, through the Rosetta mode of Geekbench, you see what about everyone says, about a 25% loss in performance. What's interesting though is even in Rosetta, the M1 is faster than an i7 from a 2018 MacBook Pro in every way, single-threaded and multi-threaded, which I think is pretty fascinating. And then even more so than the i5, which of course, the i5 is only a 4-core, 4-thread processor. The i7, the 8750 in the MacBook Pro, is a 6-core, 12-thread processor. The M1, of course, be a little confusing. It's 8 cores, but 4 of those cores are low power cores. So it's really a 4-core machine, which I think is impressive when you think about the multi-thread capabilities. So when you think about the M1 in the 13-inch MacBook Pro, or even more importantly, in the MacBook Air, and we know it's nearly the same power as this, the fact that it outclasses a 15-inch MacBook Pro that costs more than twice. I mean, this machine cost $2,500, when it came out, or even the version sold today. That's crazy, right? You're looking at almost double the performance for half the price. Now, if we look at the Ryzen PCs, the first thing to note, there are 2 at the 5600, and that was just to show you a little bit of the memory scaling, and that you do actually see a performance uplift, right? Instead of just stock like 2133 megahertz going to what everyone says the ideal 3600, you see a slight uplift in performance on Geekbench for the new Ryzen chip. As far as the older Ryzen 1700, you can see that single-threaded performance is really a weak point of that, although multi-threaded's pretty good or really good. It beats sort of all the Intel machines from that era, but it's obviously lacking in single thread. It's using 3000 megahertz RAM simply because, on those early Z370 motherboards, that was honestly all you could really afford to get stable. Some people get 3200, a little bit higher, but it was actually pretty hard to do, and 3000 was sort of the highest I could go getting it stable. So it is nice to see with Ryzen on the newer motherboards, newer chips, you get higher memory frequency, and it does give you a little bit better performance. Finally, at the bottom, we have this grouping of the older Apple devices, so the A11 and the iPhone 10, and then the A10X on the iPad Pro, and the X will have better graphics, but we'll look at that later. What I just wanted to point out here is both of these devices are substantially more capable than this little Intel Core M in the old 2015 12-inch MacBook. So even in 2017, 2 years after the MacBook, you can see that Apple's low-power devices were already outpacing Intel's low-power devices by a substantial amount. I mean, double the multi-threaded capabilities and about 30% uplift on single-thread performance. So it's pretty clear, and I'm sure Apple has been planning this transition to Apple Silicon for many, many years. And as they saw their progression rapidly outpacing Intel, particularly in low-power devices, which is important to Apple and their thin form factor, they've been planning for this for a while. On the other hand, it definitely makes sense that Apple waited. If Apple had tried to make a Mac with the A11, it'd still be barely competing with Intel. I'm sure they could do some things to outperform, but it wouldn't feel like that big jump, and all the headaches to get it to work, it wouldn't feel substantial. So now that they've waited to essentially what is the A14 or the M1, we really see these substantial improvements where you're looking at almost double the single thread performance of even a rather high-end Intel i7 like what is in the MacBook Pro. So when we go to Cinebench, we see mostly the same thing, but a few differences. Now, first to note, of course, there's no Rosetta mode for Cinebench, and the iOS devices can't run it, so they don't have results. However, looking at the results we do have, we can see that the Mac Mini still outclasses, the MacBook Pro and the iMac. Maybe not quite as much, particularly on the single thread. It's not quite as much as a jump, and versus the Ryzen machine, it's a little bit different. So now the Ryzen 5600 actually pulls ahead just slightly on single thread performance. You'll also notice, though, it does not benefit as much from the RAM speed, and I wasn't sure why, but actually when the single thread is slightly worse, and I ran the test a couple of times with the faster RAM, not really sure why that is, but the multi-threaded, you do see the Ryzen benefit from that faster RAM. In any case, you see that the Ryzen 5600 in this case outclasses the M1, in both single and multi-threaded capability, although maybe slight. And this is probably to do with, the 5600 has 6 real cores, we'll say, and sort of 12 threads, as where the Mac Mini is just 4 performance cores and then 4 low power cores. Likewise, you see even the old Ryzen, the 1700, as far as multi-threaded, because it has 8 cores, 16 threads, is quite capable, and so it does beat the M1. And then at the very bottom, it's very sad, that poor little Intel Core M from the MacBook. It really is just anemic in performance. What's fascinating is most of these other machines, right? The M1 Mac Mini, the Ryzen 5600, those single thread performance actually outclasses the multi-thread of that poor little dual core, MacBook. So I realize it's a 5-year-old machine, but I think everyone knew even when that machine came out, it was just underpowered, and so it really has not aged well. Okay, now we're going to look at the graphics performance of the M1 versus these other devices. So a quick explanation of how I did these benchmarks. So, the first two, the yellow and the orange, notice are the Geekbench, the standard Geekbench scores. So Geekbench tests OpenCL, which is sort of a more or less universal across Mac and PC anyway, sort of compute engine. And then they have a specific Metal API test for Mac. On the PC, though, it's using Vulkan. So obviously, it's not quite an apples to apples comparison, but I do think Metal and Vulkan are probably the most similar graphics API, and this is the most similar comparison, you could try to find. It's arguably better than like DirectX. Although DirectX is, Microsoft's implementation and Metal is Apple's. Vulkan is very much like DirectX 12, and it's sort of standardized, and AAA games like Doom, for example, are built using Vulkan. And finally, it's also helpful because we also use the GFX Bench 5, and GFX Bench has a number of different tests. I standardize around the Aztec High, the 1440p off-screen. So I wanted to make sure it was off-screen, so that, because different devices have different native resolutions, so it's fair for everything. And then also, I use the Vulkan API for these tests on the GFX Bench to also try to have some more standardization. GFX Bench does offer a DirectX test on their PC side, but Geekbench does not, and so I felt this was the fair comparison. Another thing just to note, for the GFX Bench 5, Vulkan always performed the best. So for example, Vulkan performed better than DirectX 9, 10, 11, or 12. So this is also putting the PC in the best light, which I think is good and fair. Each device should be at their best, and we know the Mac is already at their best using Metal, so the PC should be at their best. Okay, let's look at the scores. So let's look at the top 3 just to start. And the first thing you'll note, of course, the Geekbench scores should not be directly compared to the GFX Bench score, right? These are 2 totally different scales or anything. So you don't really want to make any note of that. It's just you want to compare them across to each device. So for example, what's interesting is if we look at Geekbench, both OpenCL and Vulkan, we could see that it's almost double, not quite, it's like 70%, more than the AMD Radeon Pro 555X and the MacBook Pro. But then if you look at the GFX Bench, you could see it's actually substantially more than double. It's like 2.5 times, right? Because you're looking at 5,000 versus 2,000. So it's interesting in that GFX benchmark, it actually really favors the graphics in the M1. In any case, if you look at a whole as a device, so if you look at this 2018 MacBook Pro, which again, costs $2,500 and is only 2 years old, and this benchmark surprised me the most out of the entire thing, but is that the M1 graphics outclasses even the AMD Radeon Pro graphics, handily, almost. I mean, it destroys it. It's roughly twice the power. And the Radeon Pro, is already even a little more than twice of the integrated graphics. So if you didn't have that AMD chip and you just are using the Intel integrated graphics, you're already looking at double. So anyway, when you go to the M1, you're now looking at 4 times the performance. And this is important because, for example, if you want to compare to the older Mac Mini, it's using essentially these UHD 630 graphics. So you're looking at that 4x performance. Or if you want to look at the MacBook Air with the M1 or the 13-inch MacBook Pro, which does not have a dedicated graphics card, you really see that this M1 graphics just destroys what Intel had and is much faster. But the fact that it even beats the AMD Radeon Pro 555 really surprised me. That I think was the biggest surprise for me. And so basically what that means, if you buy a MacBook Air for $900, even with, I know it has a 7-core GPU, so you're looking at 10 to 15% performance loss, even that version that's $900, it will outclass a 15-inch MacBook Pro, right, across the board. And I know, there are newer, like the 16-inch, and you could get an i9, you could get the Radeon Vega graphics and things. Certainly those, more, and I'm sure people have done benchmarks on those, but then you're looking at $3,000-$4,000, right? And so even the fact that a $900 MacBook Air with M1 outclasses the base level 15-inch MacBook Pro, which is like $2,500, is crazy. It's crazy. And I think that's why this M1 is so exciting. I think that's why so many people are doing benchmarks and reviews like myself. If you love computer hardware, it doesn't matter if you hate Apple or whatever, like you have to love the M1 because this is the future and this is going to change so much. And we'll talk more about that when we get into power consumption at the end because this is really just the beginning. In any case, if we do go to an actual desktop machine, just starting with the iMac from 2017, which has the Radeon Pro 570, well, we start to see a different story. And in fact, the graphics in that iMac is better than this new M1. What is interesting, and I ran this test a number of times, I wasn't sure why, on Geekbench, the Radeon Pro 570, beats the M1 by a pretty good margin. I mean, you're looking at like 50% increase. But on the GFX bench, it is actually worse. It's like 20% worse. And I really, this surprised me. I wasn't sure why. I ran the test multiple times, but that was, the results were always in that number. So again, this is just the nature of synthetic benchmarks, things like that. I guess I was surprised because I assumed the GFX bench I felt like is more accurate to like what an actual game would be playing, as for the Geekbench ones feel more artificial. So I actually thought the Radeon Pro would have the advantage in gaming and stuff like that, where it doesn't appear to be. Now, we'll do gaming tests. I'll talk about that next. There's some interesting notes about that. In any case, I think what this shows is that if you do have the right API and the game is built well, so Metal API and stuff like that, that the M1 is fairly capable. It's not going to blow anyone's minds, not by a long shot, but it's fairly capable in a compact package. Again, for a desktop machine like in that Mac Mini, it's maybe not that impressive. We're about to compare it to the PC in a second, but if you consider the M1 and the MacBook Air 13-inch MacBook Pro, and you're comparing it to like the Intel integrated graphics, I mean, yeah, this is a game changer and it's very exciting. Okay, so looking at the PCs, obviously this RX 5700, which is not the most crazy graphics card, but it's it's a good card. It's roughly on par with the NVIDIA 1080. It's just a year old, and it's a great card that doesn't use too much power, right? It uses less than 200 watts. Anyway, you can quickly see that it just destroys everything, right? I mean, if the M1 is 3 times Intel's, graphics, UHD 630 graphics, well, the 5700 is 3 times the M1. And it's more than double the 570, 2.5 times. So you're looking at pretty substantial graphics increase, and this is across the board. So so if you look at the OpenCL, which should be like the most universal compute, the 5700 still trounces everything on the Mac, including the M1. And then of course the Geekbench, it's going to be Metal versus Vulkan, so a little bit, but you're still looking at substantial increase. And then finally, GFX Bench 5, which is also Vulkan on the PC, right? We're looking at more than double either the M1 or the Radeon Pro 570. I should also say real quick, you will notice that the AMD RX 5700, it performs better with the new Zen 5600 than the old 1700X. And you see this actually across the board, right, in every benchmark from Geekbench to GFX. And so if you're wondering, will my Generation 1, Zen 1 1700 CPU bottleneck, a modern graphics card? Well, sadly, the answer is yes. So even a 5700, which is mid-range, is actually slightly bottlenecked by the old Ryzen chip. And that probably has to do with just the lackluster single thread performance. And so just going to this new Zen 3 5600, the graphics card can actually breathe more fully, and you see a pretty decent performance increase in every single benchmark. Now, of course, this isn't a totally fair comparison. I mean, the RX 5700 is a whole, generation newer than what the Radeon Pro 570 was. It's using, AMD's RDNA architecture, as where the 570 was still on the GCN architecture. So it also, it's using more power than even what the iMac would have used for the graphics. But in any case, I think the reason why this is still interesting and relevant is when you talk about costs of these machines and how much the iMac in 2017 costs versus how cheaply you could get a 5700 in 2019 or something like that. It just shows, well, this is why games aren't really made for Mac, right? And why Apple has always struggled in the gaming department. Because your cost per dollar of graphics performance, you can just get something so much better on the PC for so much cheaper. Because sure, it would be great, to upgrade to a newer iMac that has an RX 5500, or you can even get the 5700 in the high-end one. But then it's, well, I paid 2,000 something for this 2017 iMac, and do I really want to then just 2 years later pay another $3,000? It's like, no, that doesn't make sense. So yeah, and then of course you could also make hypothesis and be like, okay, well, an iMac with a 5700, if you have a new iMac, well, that's obviously still going to outclass the M1. And so I think sort of the takeaway that we could see is the M1 is really, really impressive for an integrated graphics. It's not quite there on the dedicated side of things. So it will be really interesting to see how Apple, address that with future models. Of course, when we look at power consumption, I'm sure they will be able to do this, and it will be really interesting how they do that. Finally, a quick note on the bottom. I did still throw in the old Apple A11 and A10X, as well as the sad little Intel HD Graphics 5300 on the 12-inch MacBook Pro. So what you see here, now the iOS devices, I only can do Geekbench Metal benchmark, right? I can't get the OpenCL, and there's no GFX bench for that. So, but at least with the Geekbench, we see that it substantially outclasses the Geekbench score on the Intel HD 5300. So yeah, Intel has just really struggled with low power devices. They've really struggled with graphics, and it just makes so much sense why Apple has wanted to get away from them for so long, because your iPhone from 2017 is better than your laptop from 2015. Okay, but twice that in just 2 years, as where the graphics and the integrated side haven't really got there. For example, even if we look at the Intel HD 630 graphics, that Geekbench score 4,478, well, okay, that's a little bit better than your 11 iPhone, but it's still substantially less than the A10X, which is in the iPad Pro, which has their extra graphics cores. It's considered their more graphics engine. And so, I mean, that's just silly, right? Like that the A10X, which is a year older than the Intel integrated graphics in the 2018 MacBook Pro, and it has way less thermals, way less power, and yet this A10X has better graphics than the Intel integrated ones, which is what Apple had to put in their Mac Minis and their 13-inch MacBook Pros, where they couldn't fit a dedicated card. And obviously, if you look at the A12X or the new A13, A14, I mean, they continue to just trounce Intel in this area. And the last thing to observe as well, if you want a fanless, thin laptop design, Apple first tried this in 2015 with the 12-inch MacBook. And look at those graphics numbers. They're really anemic. And then look at the graphics in the Apple M1. And this is what you can get now in a fanless, compact MacBook Air. And it's just insane. I mean, this is the biggest jump ever, right? And yeah, it's been 5 years, but we can look at other devices in 5 years and they don't have this kind of performance increase because you're literally looking almost across the board. You're looking at like 10, I think it's 9x increase on the M1. And so, if you want a compact laptop device, obviously Apple has wanted to make this device for 5 years now. They did it with the 12-inch, to maybe some success, but now they have really. I think this is kind of the fulfillment of their vision that they've wanted to do 5 years ago. Okay, let's take a look at actual game benchmarks. So I just ran Starcraft 2, and there's a couple of reasons for that. But on the outset, the question that everyone's asking is, well, can you game with the Apple M1? And my short answer is no. Like, you really cannot. I mean, I guess depending on how much sacrifice you want to make, but it's still pretty limited. Now, let's talk about this. Okay, so StarCraft 2 is a very single thread intensive game, which is why I chose it for the benchmark, because we could see benefits from the CPU side as well as the graphics side, even though it's a very old game. However, unlike World of Warcraft, which Blizzard has already ported to Apple Silicon, and so StarCraft 2 still runs on Rosetta, which we know is about 75% of the CPU performance. And for graphics, it's really hard to tell how much of a hit you're taking, but obviously there is something there. But what I want to show you is that, okay, despite all those things, what you see in the actual game performance is nothing at all with what we saw on the benchmarks. So if you remember, the M1 Mac Mini should actually be comparable to the Radeon 570 Pro. It's slightly faster than the GFX bench, but then it's maybe 50%, pretty wide margin slower on Geekbench. But you go to actually playing a game, which obviously is not optimized for the M1. The Radeon 570 Pro still is so much faster, and so at 4K, so I try to do 4K high as a standardized test across all the platforms, and you see the M1 Mac Mini just can't do it. At 7 frames, it's unplayable. So to get the M1 Mac Mini playable, I had to go to StarCraft 2 1080p medium. So at that resolution, you see the 570 Pro substantially better. I mean, it's more than double. It's like 2.2x the performance, which is more, right, than the benchmarks showed. They only showed maybe a 1.3 improvement, 1.5. And then if you go to the 4K resolution, well, it's not even, I mean, now you're looking at like 10x, from 7 frames to, 56 frames, or 8x or something like that. Anyway, so obviously you could see that there's just things are not optimized. It's struggling at the 4K resolution. There's probably a lot of factors for that. It doesn't have any dedicated video memory. It's using the shared memory architecture. And of course, the real summary of this, though, is software. It's the game, right? Other games will perform better. We know benchmarks perform better. But until the software catches up, it's unlikely that the M1 is really going to be a good gaming platform. It could be, but it's not right now. And the sad reality is, maybe you expect, oh, well, all these games are going to get updated and all these things. Well, sad reality is they're not, right? Because game companies are really invested in spending time on things that make them money. And so World of Warcraft had Apple Silicon support on day one. Well, why is that? It's because they still have millions of subscribers, and a large number of them play on Mac, and so it made sense for them to make this call. StarCraft 2, sadly, is a dying game, and the user base on Mac is way less, right? I mean, the total user base of StarCraft 2 is maybe less than just the Mac user base on World of Warcraft. So they're just not financially incentivized to make that optimization. Maybe they will eventually, sure. It's still not going to be a great optimization, just like already StarCraft 2's Metal implementation, even on Intel chips, is not great, and it does not perform as well as the CPU version. And so you're going to see this with lots of games, well, older games that have been optimized for PC and just there isn't the care that developers have taken to optimize them for Mac, which is a shame. Hopefully, though, and again, sort of the point of this video is that the M1, what makes it exciting is not the M1 itself, but it's just the beginning. And it's what Apple will make next and what new software can make when it's tailored for these new Apple silicons. And then, yes, then I think you're in for a very exciting new age of potentially AAA games for the Mac, because essentially the Mac is going to become like a game console. It's going to be the most optimized, efficient, like general computing platform on the planet. That's the whole point of the Apple Silicon and their shared memory architecture and all these things, is to prevent waste that occurs in a traditional sort of modular PC setup. And so essentially, Macs are now consoles. They're Xboxes and PlayStations. And at least for gaming, that's really exciting. That's the potential for huge optimizations. But we're not there yet. We're not there on the software side, the developer support, and frankly, the M1 graphics is not spectacular, right? I mean, we've already looked, even when it's at its best, it's just not quite there yet. So what we want to see, if this is an 8-core GPU, we really need 3 times the raw performance to get into like PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, or Radeon 5700 territory. So essentially, we need a 24-core GPU, and if it does scale linearly, well, then you're in for some exciting games and performance, particularly when developers optimize for that platform. Finally, I did want to note on the AMD 5600X, what's awesome is you actually see almost double the performance going from a 1700X. So if you're thinking about upgrading from a Zen 1 to a Zen 3 chip, I would say absolutely do it. It's so worth it. You're literally getting twice the performance. And if you have your PC for games like I do, it makes such a big difference. And it's really awesome because I didn't even upgrade my graphics card. So you can see, Starcraft 2 is single-threaded, very performant game. And with the same graphics card, the 5700, I used to only get 120 frames at 4K high, and now it's over 220. And so I can play at like 4K extreme and all these things, and it's over 120 frames. And I could never do this with the old AMD Zen chip. So yeah, the 5600 is really exciting. The new performance is really great. And for games, obviously we could see that the software is optimized, and you also just have the raw hardware. And so, PC is still really the dominant gaming platform, for games, and you just see that performance is just so much greater. And for example, I didn't even bother doing the benchmarks at like the medium 1080p setting on the PC because it would just destroy. And from the high 4K, you already kind of see just it's in a whole different class. Okay, let's recap everything we've talked about. I know this is a long video. Thanks for hanging in there. And let's just kind of look at some takeaways. So what I did is I combined both the Cinebench and the Geekbench single and multi-threaded scores. I also took the Geekbench Metal Vulkan and then the GFX Bench Metal Vulkan scores and sort of combined them all. So it's a blend, right? So I have a blend of single multi-threaded scores and then graphics scores all combined into one. And what I did is I normalized the M1 as 100%. I set it to 1, and everything else is a percentage of that, either less or greater, because I think that's what's really interesting and really important here is essentially how does your computer stock up to the M1, and what does that mean for the future? Because if Apple can create this kind of performance and they only uses 10 watts of power, and they can make the thing pretty cheap, it's going to be all their future devices. This really is the new standard. I mean, you really have to think of the significance of the M1 is not its crazy benchmarks, but as like the new baseline, the new bottom of the benchmarks, right? Like you should be at least as powerful as the M1 because of how power efficient it is. So that's kind of what we're doing. And so if you look at the MacBook Pro, and this is using its integrated graphics. It's every device we're trying to put in the best light. But you see that the MacBook Pro is significantly outclassed. Single and threaded performance, right? 2/3 of the M1, and the graphics is like half. So if you think about upgrading your laptop, it really does make sense, and it'll be really exciting. When Apple makes a new 15-inch with whatever the M2 or M1X is going to be. Finally, the iMac, is an interesting beast because the CPU is rather weak and is outclassed by the M1, But the graphics, even in this older machine, is better than what's in the M1. So for desktop machines or for gaming machines, the M1 is still maybe not exactly what you want. Finally, when we look at a brand new PC, all in the best light, the best specs, the fast memory settings, with AMD Zen 3, we find a couple of interesting results. The first is that it's slightly worse on single thread, but almost identical. I mean, you're not going to notice a difference. But of course, the Ryzen 5 is using a lot more power to get that same single thread. And then this is just a 6-core, but it is a little bit better on the multi-threaded performance. Finally, though, graphics, and this is just that whole Mac versus PC debate and just the benefit when you can have a giant case and you don't care about thermals and you don't care about power and all this stuff. The graphics in any, relatively pretty good PC is just so much better than the M1. You're looking almost three times the graphics performance in the desktop PC. Finally, though, if you look at the old Core M, which is a fanless, MacBook 12-inch, and this is the most exciting performance, right? It's horrible. It's anemic, and if you were to get the M1 and the MacBook Air, you're looking at such a huge jump, literally 10 times graphics performance, three times the single thread, and 5 to 6 times the multi-thread performance. So, yeah, the M1 is exciting as far as compact laptop devices. For desktop, not yet, but it's more exciting of what are the things to come. So thanks for watching. In the next video, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what does all this mean, how does power consumption play into this, and what does it mean for the future of Apple devices and really the future of computing and computing devices and how it's going to force everybody, whether it's NVIDIA, since they've just bought ARM, Intel, AMD, to compete because of what Apple's doing.